Hello, my name is Madison Nobbs, and I am the Executive Director of the Ketamine Assisted Therapy Association of Canada. We are a dynamic and innovative member-based not-for-profit organization that is focused on the advancement of ketamine-assisted therapy. We hold the vision of having this therapy be available in a safe, accessible, and responsible way across Canada, which includes outside of highly restricted and inaccessible hospital settings and in the safe hands of caring physicians and therapists. There is an incredible unmet need for effective treatments for depression, suicidality, and other mental health conditions. It is important that the regulation of ketamine and psychedelic medicines be ethical and carefully considered, as the impacts and outcomes on society will be great. As an organization, we are committed to providing a transparent and inclusive platform for these discussions to take place to encourage the most engagement and collaboration possible. We very much look forward to engaging with you all further.
We have long known that psychedelics have powerful healing mechanisms, and we are finally at a place where we are able to explore the healing power in a very safe environment for our patients.
They have shown remarkable ability to catalyze transformation in these areas where traditional medications have shown almost no effect.
The therapy is enhanced with having another person in the room guiding you on this journey and helping you to integrate what comes up through this session.
So welcome everyone to the first annual World Psychedelics Day. My name is Shannon Smedella and I'm your host for this episode. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our expert speakers for today. So first up, we have Rick Doblin. Rick Doblin, PhD, is the founder and executive director of the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, also known as MAPS. He received his doctorate in public policy from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, where he wrote his dissertation on the regulation of the medical uses of psychedelics and marijuana, and his master's thesis on a survey of oncologists about smoked marijuana versus the oral THC pill in nausea control for cancer patients. His undergraduate thesis at New College of Florida was a 25-year follow-up to the classic Good Friday experiment, which evaluated the potential of psychedelic drugs to catalyze religious experiences. He also conducted a 34-year follow-up study to Timothy Leary's Concord prison experiment. Rick studied with Dr. Stanislav Grof and was among the first to be certified as a holotropic breathwork practitioner. His professional goals are to help develop legal context for the beneficial uses of psychedelics and marijuana, primarily as prescription medications, but also for personal growth for otherwise healthy people and eventually to become a legally licensed psychedelic therapist. He founded MAPS in 1986 and currently resides in Boston with his wife, dog, and empty rooms from 3 children, one of whom is in college and 2 who have graduated. So welcome, Rick Doblin. Thank you so much for being here with us. I know I've read that bio many times before, and it's definitely a pleasure to see you again here today. So thank you for being with us.
My pleasure to join you all today.
We have Adam Wright with us as well. Adam Wright is Base Camp Director at Field Trip, which is the world's first integrated company in legal psychedelics. With current and planned operations in North America, the Caribbean, and Europe, Field Trip's goal is to become the recognized global leader in medical and therapeutic applications of psychedelics. Adam spent a decade serving as a Navy SEAL and national security professional. After witnessing the transformative potential of psychedelics, he seeks to introduce veterans and other frontliners to medically supervised, evidence-based therapies. So thank you so much, Adam, for joining us, and welcome to this talk. It's great to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Shannon. Thanks for organizing this.
Mhm. And then we also have Matthew Johnson. Matthew W. Johnson, PhD, is the Susan Hill Ward Endowed Professor of Psychedelics and Consciousness Research at Johns Hopkins. Working with psychedelics for 17 years, he is one of the world's most published psychedelic experts. He published Psychedelic Safety Guidelines in 2018, helping to resurrect psychedelic research. He developed the first psychedelic treatment of tobacco addiction. He has published on psychedelics and safety factors, mystical experience, personality change, cancer-related distress treatment, and depression treatment. His 2018 psilocybin review recommended Schedule 4 upon medical approval. Matt has been interviewed by Anderson Cooper on 60 Minutes, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the BBC, Fox Business News, Tim Ferriss, Ezra Klein, Michael Pollan, and many others. So thank you so much, Dr. Johnson, for being here with us today. It is definitely a pleasure.
My pleasure to join you all. Thank you.
All right, so let's get into it. It is going to be an interesting conversation that we have here today, and we have many questions for you. So we'll definitely get started with those. So first off, again, thank you for being here. And we want to know, we're here on the first ever World Psychedelics Day. What is the most urgent thing that you want the world to know about psychedelics?
Well, I'll start by just saying that humanity as a whole, feels to me and to many of us, to be in a crisis. We're sort of like lemmings going over the cliff, in the sense that we're destroying the environment. There's a rise of authoritarianism. There's religious wars. There's incredible technology that's enormously destructive potential, and we don't really have the emotional and spiritual maturity to deal with the technological advances that we have developed. And psychedelics can help us develop that kind of emotional and spiritual maturity, both as individuals, and enough individuals and groups have it, then eventually collectively. So I think psychedelics are coming to the fore at a time when they're needed now more than ever. So I think people should realize that there is incredible potential, but the potential is not in the drug. It's in how it's used. It's in the relationship that we have with the drug, and that it needs to be approached carefully and cautiously, but that these are tools for dramatically accelerating growth and moving beyond ourselves. And I'll just share that I had this incredible moment back in 1985 with Dave Nichols, and who was incredible chemist who started Hefter, and Albert Hoffman, who was the invented LSD, and we're all doing MDMA together. And this was Albert's first time with MDMA. But what they were talking about was this view that the beauty of chemistry, of looking at the atomic structures of molecules and how they would manipulate molecules to make new psychedelics, and just how incredible that was. But then it took a dark turn, the conversation, and it went into this idea that the same kind of manipulations of atomic level manipulations can produce nuclear weapons. And that they had this feeling that the psychedelics could be an antidote to this destructive power of nuclear weapons, and of the need for humanity to grow in spiritual and emotional ways. So that's what it's kind of a long response to your question, but I think I'd like people to know that there is hope, there are opportunities for growth, and that if we approach psychedelics carefully and responsibly, they can really play a role, I think, in helping humanity veer away from going over the cliff and more towards the Garden of Eden.
Thank you so much, Rick. Adam, did you want to go next on that question?
Sure. Yeah, I think I just want to, I guess, nod in assent to Rick's speech there. I worked in the national security apparatus for many years, and now I'm on the psychedelic side. So maybe I'm balancing some things out, and kind of living in that dichotomy there. But to what I would say right now, urgently to two categories of people that I often talk with, to those who are really resistant to psychedelics and to those who are overeager, is it's not magic. It's there's science to this. It's not magic. But also it's not going to cure everything, and it's not a silver bullet that's just going to magically heal people. So
thank you, Adam. And we're definitely going to ask you, as well as the rest of the panelists today, life before psychedelics, what was that like, and how you got into psychedelics. So we'll save that one for a little bit longer. But Matt, if you want to dial in on that as well.
Yeah. A lot of things come to mind when it comes to what's the most important thing for people to know. One of the things, just to go into a territory that hasn't been directly touched upon, is that really what the power of psychedelics for mental health treatment, or for just the betterment of well people, really they fundamentally differ than other drugs that we call psychiatric medications. This treatment modality is not about quelling symptoms. It's not about the ongoing use of a substance in order to mask symptoms. And sometimes that's nothing against that, but if you have an option that can actually address the root causes of mental disorders, that's going to be better. And that's what psychedelics are about. They really are more akin to good, effective psychotherapy than they are akin to the traditional psychiatric medications. Akin to psychotherapy or just meaningful life experience. People have experiences that they learn from, and this changes them. And in this way, people are doing, I like to think, they're doing their own heavy lifting when they heal with psychedelics. And there's a sense of agency, and that's part of why I think they have such lasting effects.
So what are you all working on right now? If we could go around and you can just give us an update on what's currently going on in your world. We'll start with you, Rick.
Okay, well, we actually have a massive plan. The challenge is that you succeed at one thing, and then your ambitions grow and you try to do more. And so that's our situation. So what we're most working on right now is thinking about what does it really mean to commercialize a drug, meaning to provide patient access. So we have one successful phase 3 study. We're trying to finish the second phase 3 study. We think that'll be less than a year and a half from now. We think by the end of 2023, we'll have FDA approval, if all goes well. But just getting it approved doesn't get it into patients. So we're trying to imagine and think about, how do we train thousands of therapists? How do we raise all this money for commercialization, which we've been told could be in the neighborhood of $80 million. If we were big pharma, $80 million is what big pharma more or less would spend to commercialize, to prepare all your teams. And we're also interested in globalization. So on the World Psychedelic Day, it's natural to talk about globalization. So we want to bring MDMA phase 3 research to Europe. We want to bring it all over the world. We've been in touch with people in Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Rwanda, Somaliland, Brazil, Chile, all over the place, Palestine, Israel. So it may be kind of shocking, I'd say, but what we think we need is about another $150 million, and but not all at once. So if that's any easier for people, we need 50 million a year for 3 years. So what we're really trying to figure out is, how do we get that money? Can we get that from philanthropy? Can we get that from impact loans? Can we take investors? And all of those things have their trade-offs. So that's what we're mostly working on now, is how do we really scale this? There's roughly 8 million PTSD patients in the United States, 8 or 9 million, but there's over 350 million PTSD patients around the world. So how do we get the resources? And we could do an IPO and we could get hundreds of millions of dollars, but once you have investors, everything changes as far as what your priorities are, where you set the price point. So yeah, our challenge and what we're most working on now is trying to develop our story to try to, basically we're talking about, can we motivate philanthropists to give us a bridge to sustainability? And the sustainability we think will be in the middle of 2024. And that will be sustainability from the sale of MDMA by prescription in the benefit corp, where it is still making a profit, but you maximize public benefit over profit. So that's our current challenge.
Thank you so much, Rick. And it's great to know, what is on the horizon of psychedelic therapy and medicine here as well. Adam, how are things going over there with you at Basecamp?
Well, good. Well, Field Trip more broadly, we are a for-profit company, and so we've done the IPO route and definitely are dealing with some of the economic imperatives that come with that. But we are focused on building out the infrastructure to deliver psychedelic therapies at scale. So I think we have 7 clinics operating right now. We're hoping to have 16 by the end of the year. And much more by the end of next year. We're also developing a synthetic molecule in our R&D wing, which is called Discovery. I'm personally focused on the minutia of launching a platform for veterans and frontliners and continuing to refine that. Even though I work for a nonprofit, I'm still looking for money. I could use $100 million to help pay for veterans to go through this therapy. The biggest challenge is cost. So we've treated in the US a number of veterans and frontliners all at no cost, but it's really difficult to scale that up without revenue. So that's a challenge for us as well.
Thank you so much. And we'll go over to Matthew as well.
Yeah, what I'm working on, we're studies. So that's sort of like what we do mainly with psilocybin, but not just with psilocybin. So I'm continuing this line of research, helping people quit tobacco smoking. And so we're nearing our completion of an 80-person study, randomized study, hoping to continue that work, potentially moving into phase 3 trials in the future. I have several studies that I'm going to be leading for which we've received the funding, but we're in the process of sowing those regulatory seeds. So I have protocols with the FDA and the DEA. So some of those, one is a study using LSD to treat chronic pain. So this is, I think, can be really exciting. For one, because it's treating one major funnel into the opioid epidemic. That's the people who are using opioids in the context of chronic pain aren't necessarily having a use disorder right now, but are at high risk of it. And so, but the goal of minimizing or stopping the use of opioids. The other reason, because it's LSD, it's about time to have a therapeutic trial with high dose LSD in the United States. And so we're going to try to make that happen. Other than that, I'll be leading a study using psilocybin to treat opioid use disorder. So these are people with active addiction to opioids, and also leading a study using psilocybin to treat PTSD. And so we'll hopefully see whether it has, anything like the success that Rick and company have seen with MDMA. And so our larger group at Hopkins, there's, about 8 other studies that we're, working on the regulatory seeds for. So we've got a big operation largely with psilocybin, but those are some of the projects that I'm most focused on right now.
Matt, could you talk a little bit about Eric Cast's work with LSD for pain? Because you're really trying to pick up on something that was very early in the history of LSD research and it's been abandoned for a very long time. So it's great to hear what you want to do there.
Yeah, absolutely. So Eric Cast published the earliest research actually using psychedelics in cancer patients. But his initial idea wasn't to, sort of cause the long-term, emotional stabilization and coming to grips with their with the near-death anxiety with folks. That's what he ended up finding. But he was just simply interested in this novel compound as an analgesic. He compared it and in controlled research to hydromorphone, a high potency opioid, very similar to heroin, virtually identical, in fact, and found that it actually served acutely, like while people were having the effects, as just as good of an analgesic. But much more importantly, and the thing that really struck him was that, weeks after the experience, people had this psychological reorientation. In fact, that there's just some beautiful language in his paper where he described it's like, this is like early 60s, right? This isn't like late 60s, and he was talking about or I guess it was early mid 60s. So not everyone was sort of, the psychedelics hadn't really hit big into popular culture, but he was talking about, wow, the patients came away with this peculiar language, talking like folks from some of these Eastern religions. People were experiencing these transcendental states that kind of stuck with them, that influenced their orientation towards death. And he called it the what did he call it, the attenuation of anticipation. This idea that they had been stuck in their mental life, all about what's going to happen in the future. When's the tumor going to come back? When am I going to, how painful it's going to be? And so there's an attenuation of that. Like they were able to actually live life in the present without, this incredible suffering growing because of what was to come. So it's very much indeed picking up on that early work and going to, be looking at, have that emphasis on the long-term pain reductions, because we know now the science on pain itself has evolved over the decades. We know very well now that pain has, both direct afferents, related to, tissue damage and sources of pain, but very well biologically mapped out pathways mediated by the CNS, by the brain, by the spinal cord. That's the site that is the route for the psychological mediation of pain. When someone has a better outlook and they're not catastrophizing, the pain is literally better. It may not be gone, but compared to what it can be when someone is catastrophizing and just exaggerating their suffering, you can really reduce the pain. And so, by having that psychedelic experience, there's the potential to have long-lasting reductions in people's pain, with that same reorientation that we're all seeing in these various studies that people can be left with a good psychedelic experience.
Thank you so much, Matt, for adding that in. While we're on this topic, does anyone have any other questions that you would like to ask for any of the other speakers here while we have the chance?
Well, I do have a question for Adam. And this is kind of a bigger question, but it has to do directly with your national security experience. So for the longest time, I've been very interested in this idea of what are the national security implications of drug legalization? We have drug prohibition, which has never really been about stopping drug abuse. It's always had political overlays. But what it does is it siphons all sorts of money into criminal undergrounds all over the world. And some of them we like. The US government supported the Northern Alliance which made money off of opiates and stuff. So I'm just curious, what is your impression about national security implications of drug policy reform and creating legal markets for these substances rather than keeping them in the hands of criminals?
Well, I'm not an expert on counter narcotics. I never really worked in that sphere. However, I guess a lot of people will be out of a job, or at least a specialty, should that day ever come. So I think, but I think we'll all benefit from eliminating that kind of patchwork of drug legality around the globe. So
So your intuition is it might be a good thing?
I believe it certainly would be a good thing. It's my belief. So
Thank you.
Great questions, Rick. Do Matthew or Adam, do you have any questions that you'd like to add to that?
I have a random question that came from conversation with field trip personnel when we were going over the results of Rick's study, and I don't want to anticipate an additional question, but the one question that kept coming up is why an inactive placebo versus an active placebo.
Oh, okay, that's a really long question, but I can condense it. So I think that first off, active placebos, there's three different kinds. One would be sort of like what was used in some of the psilocybin projects, where they use nicotinic acid, but they don't really stay double blind. Others are like tranquilizers or stimulants that would be like MDMA. So, but don't have the fear reduction properties. So what we concluded actually, so I did a big project for my dissertation. So if you wanted to look at my dissertation, big sections is how to do double blind with psychedelic substances. And the solution that I came up with was an active placebo. It was therapy with low dose MDMA versus therapy with full dose MDMA. And that would be similar to, therapy with low dose psilocybin versus therapy with full dose psilocybin, something like that. Because everybody gets told they're going to get the drug, their expectations are all the same. But when it comes to tranquilizers, that's not so good because it reduces the effect of the therapy, and people will know something has happened. Stimulants are not so good as an active placebo because when you look at PTSD patients, they self-medicate with alcohol, they self-medicate with marijuana, with opiates. They don't self-medicate with stimulants. That could compromise the therapy as well. So I felt low-dose MDMA would be the best. And the challenge was going to be to find the dose that was high enough to cause confusion between the low dose and the high dose, but not so high that you would get so much therapeutic benefit that you'd never be able to tell the difference between the groups. And so what we discovered in practice is that my theory was wrong, and that the low doses of MDMA, well, first off, the active dose of MDMA was lower than we thought. 75 milligrams produced great results. And we found that the 25, 30, 40, 50 milligrams, people tended to not like. Now, these are PTSD patients who've been struggling with PTSD for many years. And those doses did cause confusion with full dose so that you could get blinding, but they had what we call an anti-therapeutic effect. So what it means is that people still got better. They showed reductions in their PTSD symptoms at these lower doses, but they didn't show as much reduction in their symptoms if they'd been given therapy without any MDMA at all. Because these low doses activated them, but it didn't reduce the fear that made them uncomfortable. A good analogy is when you take off in an airplane and you got turbulence at the beginning and then you get over the clouds, it's smooth sailing. But so they were in this turbulent phase. So it would have actually made it easier for us to find a difference between the groups if we used low dose MDMA and had blinding. So we went to the FDA and we basically said there's no solution to the double blind problem that we can see. And we can give you blinding, but we recommend inactive placebo. And so what the FDA said is that in reality, in actual clinical studies, the double blind doesn't work as often as people think it does, even with SSRIs, which don't have any kind of an effect like psychedelics, but they have side effects. And the people who take them report the side effects to their therapists, their doctors. They can tell from the side effect profiles. And also therapists who are trained know the difference between psychedelics and an SSRI or nicotinic acid or anything like that. So the actual, in practice, we said to the FDA, the real question is, if you can do this with therapy without a drug, why bother adding the drug? So we could give you blinding, but that's going to make it easier to show difference between the groups. And so what the FDA then said is that there's other ways to reduce experimenter bias. The main purpose of the double blind is to reduce bias. The first thing they said was random assignment, which is standard the way we design these studies, so that you want everybody similarly motivated, and then they get randomly assigned to either your test group or your control group. The other part is this very robust system of independent raters who evaluate the outcomes. That was really key, that the therapists don't evaluate the outcomes, that the people don't self-report their outcomes in that just simple way. That so the CAPS, the clinician administered PTSD scale, which I imagine is what Matt's going to be using in his psilocybin study, it's the gold standard for PTSD. It's an hour interview from a trained clinician. And so we had a pool of over 20 of these CAPS raters, monthly inter-rater reliability, and they would watch a videotape and I'll score it, make sure they scored very similarly. And they would be randomly assigned to the next person in our 15 sites, Israel, Canada, and the US, that needed an evaluation. So we would have the raters not even track the patient through the study. They would often just see the patient one time. And so we just sort of put it in the hands of the FDA. And we said, you tell us what you want to do. We do not think there's a good solution to the double blind problem. And so it was the FDA that said, we accept your recommendation, therapy with inactive placebo versus therapy with full dose. Then when we went to the European Medicines Agency to try to speak to them about phase 3 in Europe, we presented that same information. We said, here's what the FDA said. And so EMA agreed to the same design. So for our phase 3 study for Europe, it's going to be, again, therapy with inactive placebo versus therapy with MDMA. And I just want to point out one thing, which was, we all may have seen this paper that was in New England Journal of Medicine by Robin Card-Harris. It was comparing psilocybin for depression with SSRI, supposedly, treatment as usual. But in order to try to do this in a double-blind way, what he did was everybody had 2 6-hour, everybody got a pill. One group got SSRIs, one group got inactive placebo, but everybody had 2 6-hour sessions. The people that had the inactive pill on daily, they got the psilocybin. The other people got inactive placebo. And, the results were really good in many of measures, but the core measure, there wasn't enough difference between the groups. But what he did was, by going for the form of a double blind, he sabotaged the study, because the group that's treatment as usual, which is just a pill, actually also got 12 hours of therapy, which can be effective. And so that made those results better than they would have normally been if you just gave these people SSRI without therapy. And then he didn't find a difference between the two groups.
And that was what you're saying, clearly the case, Rick, because you saw a basically immediate effect of the SSRI, where you normally don't see that benefit until 3 weeks or so down the road. So it was clearly that really intense preparation that you need to get for a psychedelic session, but that's part of the package.
Yeah. So I guess the other answer to your question, Adam, is that there's 2 groups of evaluators of the data. One is academic researchers, and the other is regulatory agencies. So for regulatory agencies, we need to use the design that they agree. And I think that they understand better than academic researchers that the double blind fails in practice a lot. And so I imagine that we will get more criticism for our design at the advisory committee, where you bring in academic researchers and they're like, oh, why didn't you use a double blind, active placebo, or, this or that. So our audience is the regulators, not the academic community. And that's what we did, what the regulators told us to do.
Well, thanks for sharing. That's great. I'll take it back to field trip. I'll be a hero, I'm sure. Shannon, sorry if I derailed the train here, though.
No, that was perfect. It's wonderful to see what questions that you guys have of each other in the field, and great to hear all.
I've got one for Matt, actually. So years ago, we had a donor that died, actually, and left us money in his will, and he was mostly interested in LSD research. And so I went to Roland and I said, you're doing this psilocybin studies for cancer patients with anxiety. Would you like us to pay for an arm that does LSD? And what Roland said at the time was that LSD lasts longer than psilocybin, and he thought that it would be more or less the same, and you wouldn't be able to find a difference between the two groups unless you had very large samples. And my response to that was, well, just what about your clinical impressions? So I'm wondering, Matt, your clinical impressions once you get to this study, will you guys be looking at LSD versus psilocybin for depression? And do you have any intuition now about how they might compare?
I think those studies need to be done at some point. I mean, this initial study with LSD is going to be, relatively modest study for this, chronic pain population, and, in part give us experience administering LSD. But I mean, honestly, across the board, my impression is that there's the potential for greater efficacy with psilocybin. With LSD compared to psilocybin. I don't think we have a whole lot of formal data to point to, but sometimes at a high dose of psilocybin, and we've used the body weight adjusted dosing, which we're getting away from. We don't do in newer studies because we just published some data basically convincing us that it's not really, there's no convincing data suggesting you should do that. So, but given that we've done it that way, some of the really big guys that have been in our studies have gotten really high doses of psilocybin. And at a really high dose of psilocybin, for some people, it just gets weird. Now, okay, you increase the dose of a psychedelic, it's always going to get weird, especially a classic psychedelic. But I mean, a special type of weird where the meaning, it just gets bizarre, where it seems like they've shot past the point where they could make any meaning out of it, and it just becomes, they're in a bizarro world. And everyone's got their opinion, but my impression from from lots of accounts is that LSD has this, especially as the dose keeps increasing, that there is this clarity. And the same thing with mescaline. There is a clarity that is maintained, and it might be due to that somewhat more stimulant-like, not strong, but somewhat more stimulant-like edge to both LSD and mescaline, where there is this presence of mind where one doesn't, LSD has been described as abrasively, self-analytical, like where you can't get away from, it's even sort of stronger than psilocybin, just sort of not sort of wandering in the clouds out to some, experience that's kind of far removed from oneself, that LSD kind of like says, no, you're not going anywhere. These are your problems, and damn it, you're going to deal with them. And if you're not ready right now, guess what? I got you for another 12 hours. So we're going to talk turkey eventually. I mean, so like this kind of forceful nature to LSD. And the other thing is that I've been in a good number of sessions where, sometimes the waves come at first and it's like the person just like, oh, they're just getting used to the experience, especially for the folks that aren't that used to a psychedelic, or even they've never had anything like this with the whole psychedelic therapy framework, the going inside, the whole thing. And so it's a little challenging at the beginning. It gets a little weird. And then sort of like 4 hours into it, it's like, the beauty and the meaning really opens up deeply. And then sometimes the person says, oh gosh, guys, what time is it? I'm afraid when's this stuff supposed to be done? I don't want this to end. I'm just now getting into it. And you kind of tell them as a guide, like, oh, don't worry about that. Just accept it. And you're there right now. There's plenty of time. But in fact, you're thinking to yourself, oh man, I hope this stuff keeps lasting because it's almost going to be done. Like, the magic is happening right now. So, okay, compare that to LSD, the same time of the day. You're like, no sweat, man. Like, they're just now getting past the white water, and they're getting into the still deep, area. And it's like, all right, you've got another 10 hours to go. So I think of it as sort of to some degree, there's a randomness to these experiences. And so I call it the slot machine effect, that randomness. And so, and you can see this across sessions too, where sometimes it's just kind of weird and you don't really make much out of it, but the next session might be one of the most meaningful experiences in someone's life. So that's why, generally speaking, 2 sessions is better than 1. And they can build on each other as well, especially if both are meaningful. In that same spirit of just given the variability, hey, a 12 to 16 hour experience, the chances are higher if at any given one, hour of the experience, there's only some probability that's going to be one of the most meaningful experiences of your life. You're simply just increasing that probability that something really deep is going to happen. And when you're dealing with something like addiction, and even if you're talking about the overuse of opioids with these chronic pain patients, like that's where you might really need that to for some people, and especially at a high dose, to really dig into those very deep personal issues, to really blast them out of their normal context. So that is all like speculation, but based on anecdote. But I suspect for any number of these disorders, we need to compare these compounds, including LSD versus psilocybin. I think Roland's right in terms of like, yeah, they're going to need, because psilocybin works really good for a lot of things. So it's like the studies are going to need to have a lot of participants, because you don't have a lot of, you're comparing it to something that works really good. You think it's going to work even better. So it's going to be tough, but I think it's going to be worth it eventually. And just to take a first stab into LSD, and it'll be worthwhile, including things like, how do you deal with the long session? We're going to do sort of a tag team type scenario with the two guide teams to address that, and it'll be fun. It's unexplored for me, so yeah, looking forward to it.
That's fantastic, man. Because Stan Groff has often talked about the length of the time of LSD being an advantage, and that's kind of what you're saying. But I have a question now for Adam, which is that the molecule that you're developing, from what I've read about it, it's meant to be a shorter acting psilocybin. So could you speak, I guess, about the theory of how that would be used when Matt is starting to say that psilocybin might not be long enough in some cases?
Yeah, it's funny because that just kind of disrupted my understanding of the mechanics of how this all works. We keep trying to focus on a more containable psychedelic experience, limit the amount of time that therapists have to be in there, and reduce the costs of therapy. So I have to say, I don't know. Now I guess we have to take that into consideration. If your priority is positive patient outcomes, maybe the longer trip is more suitable. If your goal is treating as many people as possible, it's like the 80% solution. Maybe it's shortening the trip times. I don't know. I'm really curious to see how everything shakes out in the next few years with additional research. So.
Well, I have to say, I'm an empiricist, and I can make a credible argument for why, exactly like you're saying, Adam, like you really need, like in a lot of cases, it seems clear that a shorter experience than psilocybin would be effective for folks. And in terms of getting it into, mainstream treatment, there's a lot of advantages. I think we need to explore all of the above, and it might be different for different indications. If you're trying to treat some type of like really, hard set addiction, you might need those longer sessions. Other things, maybe depression, I'm just guessing, maybe 3 or 4 hours is all you need. I mean, maybe for some, something akin to a smoked DMT experience would be enough, but we should do all of the research.
Agreed.
I love this dynamic that you guys have going here, because these are all the right questions, being able to ask each other these questions here. I do have a few questions here on PTSD and MDMA as well. And Rick, I was wondering if you could give us an update. I know that you've been on a multitude of podcasts and media interviews regarding this, but just a quick update on phase 3 and what this means going forward.
Well, we recently published our results of our first phase 3 study in Nature Medicine, and we're in the midst of our second phase 3 study. And so according to the FDA, to get a drug approved as a medicine, you have to have statistical significance, which is defined as a 1 in 20 chance that the results are due to some random factor than to what your intervention is. A 1 in 20 or better, meaning lower. So that's statistical significance. And the other measure, which FDA doesn't really take into account that much is called effect size. So how big of an effect? You can have a statistically significant effect, but it can either be large or it can be small. And the more numbers of people that you have in your studies, like what Matt was just saying, that there may be a relatively small difference between LSD and psilocybin for certain things. So you need large numbers of subjects to be able to see it. So in our phase 3 study that we recently published, we were astonished that the statistical significance was 1 in 10,000 chance that it was due to a random factor rather than to the MDMA assisted therapy. So what that means is that we're very likely to get 1 in 20 chance, or 0.05, for the second phase 3 study. So unless there's problems with safety, and what that means is for us that if some more people in the MDMA group attempt suicide than in the people in the control group. So in the first phase 3 study, we had one woman tried to kill herself twice, and another woman had such strong suicidal ideation that she checked herself into a hospital to avoid killing herself. And as it turned out, both of them were in the placebo control group, not in the MDMA group. And they believed that they could tell that they were in the placebo group, and they had a certain kind of despair about that, and they didn't want to wait, which could be a year and a half, for the crossover where they could go into the study again, but this time get therapy plus full dose MDMA. So we had a great safety record. We had incredible statistical significance. We had a very large effect size. There's two different ways to look at it. One is called the placebo subtracted effect size. In a way, you're looking at the benefits in your control group, you're subtracting them from the benefits in your experimental group. And the way effect size is determined, it's effect size is across what's called a standard deviation. It's how far away are you from the average. And so a standard deviation of even 0.3 or 0.4, less than one standard deviation, FDA will approve drugs, and the SSRIs are in that range, 0.3, 0.4, 0.5, kind of small to very small, medium effect size. And 0.8 is considered to be a large effect size. So our placebo subtracted effect size was 0.91, which means that that's really the effect of the MDMA, not the therapy. So we subtract MDMA plus therapy from therapy without MDMA, you're left with the effect of MDMA. So that's 0.91, a very large effect size. But when you look at within subjects, those people that got MDMA plus therapy, it was a 2.1 effect size, enormous, 2 standard deviations away from the norm. And that meant that 2/3 of the people no longer had PTSD at the end of the study. So our results suggest that if all goes well, we are likely to succeed, and we're likely to make this into a medicine. But not only that, this is the first ever phase 3 study of psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. So I think that what we found, while it's uniquely MDMA, it's uniquely PTSD, I think it helps validate the entire field. So I think when you start thinking about the work with psilocybin that has been pioneered at Hopkins and NYU and other places, I think our results suggest that they're likely to succeed as well, based on all of their prior data as well. So it was just very encouraging. And we actually met the criteria for the FDA for approving a drug based on 1 phase 3 study instead of 2. That's an option of the FDA. We also had what's called no site-to-site variability. So this is a way where we had 15 sites. There was no one site that did way better than the rest, because the FDA is concerned. Maybe you have a couple sites, most of the patients are from there, and you've got these uniquely qualified and trained therapists, but it doesn't scale. You can't train other therapists to do that. So we actually took our best therapists who had the most experience, Michael and Annie Mithofer, in our phase 2, and we took them out of phase 3 completely. And we had them train the therapists instead of be the therapists. And so what we showed is no site-to-site variability, meaning that we think that this can scale. We think that we can train tens of thousands of therapists with help from Field Trip and others who want to do training in all these centers as well. And we hope that we'll be able to embed the training in schools of psychiatry, schools of psychotherapy, academic institutions all over the place. So I think our results from our first phase 3 study were beyond what we had hoped for, and suggest that if we're careful and the therapists really monitor everybody, for suicidality, and then we catch it before somebody reaches this point of trying to attempt to commit suicide, that we're likely to succeed, and this whole field is likely to grow, and that it will be a major change in psychiatry and psychotherapy.
Thank you for that update, Rick. And it's nice to know that all of the work that you guys are doing works synergistically as well. Adam, I do have a question for you in regards to what you're doing with Field Trip, with the alarming rates of PTSD, substance abuse, suicide in the underserved demographic of military veterans and first responders. What is the role of psychedelics in helping these men and women? And maybe you can tell us a little bit more about your work with Field Trip and how that is helping veterans in the frontline communities as well.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so you mentioned alarming rates, and they really are. And I think I'd point out another one, which is, well, you said suicide, which, there's been a lot more deaths from suicide among service members than those killed in combat in the last 20 years. So I think the number that's tossed around recently is 22 suicides per day. I think that any service member struggling with mental health issues like depression or anxiety will stand to benefit from psychedelics. But I think that psychedelics will play a particularly crucial role for a significant minority, those combat troops, those guys who have gone, men and women who have gone overseas to war zones multiple times over the last 20 years, and who are more likely to suffer from PTSD, traumatic brain injury, or even worse, comorbid PTSD and TBI. Roughly half of service members seeking treatment, or I should say roughly half of service members suffering from PTSD and TBI don't seek treatment. And then of those who do, I think it's about half don't get a proper therapeutic response to traditional therapies of cognitive behavioral therapy, EMDR, or SSRIs. So psychedelics, I think, can help fill that gap and get people back to kind of who they were maybe before they experienced so much trauma in our war zones. And I think the same applies to firefighters and policemen and ER workers, and especially after COVID. I think a lot of professions that you wouldn't have think of as being a frontline job have become frontline jobs. So hospice care, OBGYN, anybody really in a hospital these days has been dealing with COVID-related fatalities and stuff. So yeah, I think it's a really good thing we're seeing coming out of MAPS study, and hope that this space continues to develop and treat more people with PTSD, not just veterans and frontliners. Did that answer your question, or was there another part?
It did, and I do have one other part. How has access been for war vets getting access to ketamine, as we know that's one of the therapies that you work with? And has it been something that the government helps with?
Yeah, the VA has actually been, I guess, dabbling in ketamine infusions as a treatment for treatment-resistant depression. Specifically, I don't know if they've have taken the dive into treating PTSD with ketamine at all, but they've been doing that for a number of years, both within the VA and at external care providers. However, my understanding, and keep in mind the VA is kind of a black box and it's really hard to know exactly what's going on there, but my understanding is that since Johnson & Johnson's Spravato intranasal ketamine, S-ketamine, has been approved, that most of the ketamine infusions have ceased, and they've just been doing the Spravato and have had less therapeutic response. That's my understanding. I can't confirm that officially, so I don't want to seem like I'm bad mouthing Spravato or the VA. But access is tough because this stuff is not reimbursable. So if you're a veteran in the United States and you're seeking psychedelic therapy, you can either enroll in a clinical study, you can go underground and do this illegally, you can leave the country to do treatments, or you can do ketamine infusions at one of the many kind of generic ketamine infusion centers. But now Field Trip, and I think a lot of other providers are going to start following the ketamine-assisted psychotherapy model, which should have more durable therapeutic effect. So anyway, all this to say, access is not great. The government is not doing enough, and hopefully we can get them to do more. So.
Well, Adam, I'll say that I'm not quite as diplomatic as you, so I'll say that it's pretty clear that IV or IM ketamine works better than intranasal, and that's kind of a widespread view in the field. And it's also less clear, but I think more and more people are coming to understand that however you administer ketamine, it should be, you can improve the results if you add psychotherapy to it. That just treating it as a strictly pharmacological treatment doesn't get the benefits, doesn't get the integration, doesn't make it last as long. And that I'm really glad to hear more and more that I think that's where the Field Trip clinics can be the added value, where you add therapy to the ketamine, and people will seek that out.
Yeah, I agree. Thanks, Rick. So you bring some credibility that I just don't have. Yeah.
Well, you'll get it over time.
Wonderful. Thank you guys so much for that. Matthew, I do have a question for you in regards to your research. I'm just wondering if you can tell us about any other breakthroughs in your research that you've done and where you see psychedelic research going in the next years. Maybe also what other medicines might soon become a part of the healthcare options available to the public as well.
Yeah, so I mean, breakthroughs. I mean, one of the, I'm really proud of the work we've done with cigarette smoking. I mean, up until that point, that was completely uncharted territory in terms of psychedelic treatment. There were some anecdotes, some trip reports, some written accounts that haven't gotten any attention really at all out there, but they popped out to me, and it really kind of like, got my interest going. What is the nature of psychedelic addiction recovery? What does it really have to play off of the sort of the rock bottom effect? You've totally ruined your life, your spouse has left you, you've killed a promising job, you're estranged from your family, that is more typical, not always, but it's more typical of alcohol and opioids and cocaine, et cetera, and not typical of tobacco. It just is, pretty likely to kill you in the long run and make you sick, but it doesn't come with that sort of life destruction. And so, like the question being like, to what degree is this really getting at these sort of self-control issues across these different forms of addiction, even if it's one that is actually more fatal than all of the other drugs combined by a long shot, like with tobacco. Yet, there, like I said, there's not that sort of insane level of life destruction while you're still healthy, in terms of your entire life, breaking down. And so, it was an interesting question in that sense. And so we've been just, if I were to make up data, I wouldn't have made up the data that are as compelling as what we've seen, both in our initial pilot study of 15 people, and in our current trial with it, we're close to finishing up. We've had 44 people get to their 1-year follow-up, and amongst them, the people in the psilocybin group, we're seeing a 59% biologically confirmed success rate compared to a 27% success rate in the nicotine patch group. And that's just from a single psilocybin session, both getting the same cognitive behavioral therapy. So just, just really promising, more than double the success rate at a year. And those absolute numbers are just, nothing that's been published. Now that could change because it's an ongoing trial, so that could change, but nothing that's been published for anything, rivals those numbers. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed and hope that holds up. And so that's one I'm particularly, especially because it wasn't picking up on us. It was picking up on the addiction work with mainly alcohol from the old days and LSD, but it was a new thing, and there really was a question like, who the hell knows if this is going to work, And so there was a little bit of stepping out, having a leap of faith there to and it could have maybe not worked, That's why you do an experiment. So proud of that. I guess if you can call it a breakthrough, proud of that one, and just others, things in our work, just in general with the healthy participants, which predated and has our therapeutic trials and has continued since. Just our finding from our early studies that from a psychedelic experience, there's at least from a psilocybin experience, there's an increase in this personality domain called openness to experience, which is one of the big 5 personality domains. And it's, what a demonstration of, and which has now been replicated elsewhere. The definition of personality is that it doesn't change. You do get some changes across the decades of aging. In fact, what you get there, the trend is for openness to decrease as you get older and older and older. But so you could maybe call this a bit of a fountain of youth effect, because this is going in the opposite direction. But, other than these sort of like major life events and just getting older by the decade, there's never been something that you can schedule for next Thursday, in the clinic that's going to change your personality. And so I think that underlies everything else that we're talking, that's one of the things, that explains why this can be used to treat addiction, why this can be used to treat depression, why this can help people with end-of-life anxiety, as in with cancer and other diseases. So, proud of that one too.
Matt, I just wanted to pick up on one thing that you said, and related also back to history, which is, you talked about with psychedelics that you can help people confront these issues when their life is still somewhat intact, before everything has kind of fallen apart. And so Bill W., who started AA, when he experimented himself with belladonna first and then with LSD later, and so we have this whole idea in AA, you have to hit bottom in order to then sort of assess things and move on. He thought with LSD, you can precipitate that kind of psychological hitting bottom when you still have a job or you still have a relationships. So it's a tremendous advantage of using these tools in addiction.
Right. And that was also the thought that the group in Saskatchewan had, Humphrey Osmond and Abram Hoffer, that they actually wanted to, it was even more sort of dark in the sense that, like, not just hitting rock bottom, but literally mimicking the DTs, these potentially lethal reactions that someone who's like severely dependent on alcohol. Like if you go a day without it, you're going to get a seizure and potentially die, because like your body's that used to having its GABA neurons inhibited. And they thought, well, yeah, sometimes people sober up after the DTs, but sometimes they die from it too. So that's not a good treatment. But if we can mimic something with something that physiologically seems really safe, but is like, can really like scare the hell out of people. Oh, there's this new stuff called LSD. Let's give that a try. And, but interesting there, and I think it's because they were such delightful people, like good, like Humphrey Osmond. You just watch an old video of him, and he just, who wouldn't want to be a patient with this guy giving me a big dose of LSD? People had these transcendental experiences, and they weren't having, these kind of psychotomimetic experiences that were reported in the earliest studies. But nonetheless, people got better, but not because you mimic the DTs, but because of they had these sort of positive, some people, including our group and others, have called, the mystical effects, and their group didn't use that language per se, but that's what they were talking about. They were having these mystical type experiences. So it's interesting, in the, I think these are, a part of the rock bottom experience includes sometimes it includes just the hellish aspects, but then it's really, coming out of that, then there's the rebound of the transcendental experiences. And so at least at that level, like you can have that, and you can have that with cigarette smoking. We've seen it, where people really, I mean, they really dig deep and come to grips with like, why am I doing this? This is not who I am. Like, this is not, and really start to follow those psychological roots in terms of their smoking, and come to grips with their identity and agency and what is really meaningful in life to them. So yeah, I think there is something to this that, it may not be sort of you don't have to have the worst of the worst of like hitting rock bottom and nearly dying and destroying your life. You can get all of the benefit from hitting rock bottom without risking your life.
I have a question, Shannon, if I may. It's not very often you get these two gentlemen get their ear. So, and Matt, you said something about openness to change and personality, and I see a lot of resistance to treatment, to psychotherapy specifically, among veterans, that I think is rooted in a fear of changing who they actually are, that the therapy will change their personality. And they want to improve without changing at all. And I'm curious if you've seen that as a root of resistance to therapy, or Rick, given your work with veterans, maybe you've seen it as well.
Yeah, I think probably Rick with we're going to be starting to work with PTSD and hope to have a lot of veterans, but probably Rick has more to say on this, particularly with the veterans angle.
Yeah, and Rick, sorry, there's just the added dimension that I think of veterans identifying positively with the thing that traumatized them. They have this archetypal attachment to being a warrior. They sought out their war experiences, and that's who they are. And they don't necessarily want to leave that behind. So I just wanted to add that before you answer.
Yeah, well, one of the stories, this was what I talked about with Tony Macy in my TED Talk. He had this realization. He had PTSD, from Iraq. Multiple of his friends were killed. And under the influence of MDMA, he had this realization that there was a benefit for him of having PTSD, in that was the way that he was connected to his friends that had died. In a way, he was honoring their memory by suffering at their loss. And once he realized that, he was able to see himself through the eyes of his friends who had died. And he could realize that they no longer were alive. They wouldn't want him to squander his life and be disabled with PTSD. They would want to live through him rather than have him honor them by suffering. And that he could honor them in a different way by going forward in his life. And then he said, what am I going to do with the rest of my life? And in that moment, he cured himself of PTSD. Then he said, I'm on opiates and I'm taking opiates for pain, but I don't really think I'm taking it for pain. I think I'm taking it for escape, and I don't need opiates anymore. And I don't even need this MDMA anymore. I'm going to drop out of the study. I'm done. And he dropped out of the very first session. He didn't even go to the second or third session. And that was like 9 years ago, and he's fine today. So I think there is this secondary benefit, but the resistance to treatment is this, I think this, you would call it maybe toxic masculinity, this idea that, we don't have feelings, and that, you can do this kind of work, that it's a sign of weakness to break down in some way because of the horrible things that people have seen and being so exposed to so much pain and death. There is this whole sense of it as potentially a sign of weakness, and a lot, and then even in the military, I mean, you could speak to this better than me, is, how likely is it that if you start talking about these struggles, that it will change your assignments or change how your commanders see you, or maybe you get cycled, out of certain things. So that there's just a lot of resistance. But I think more and more we're helping people to see that it's a sign of strength, not a sign of weakness, to really open up to the emotional side of things. What we are seeing, which was reflected in general society, is a resistance among African-American and minority members of the military. I just thought that we would, when we started working with vets, that 40% or more of the military is minorities, and they're equally distributed into those people that are going to get PTSD, and yet we hardly got any African-American minority vets. and we see that with the vaccines. There's a kind of suspicion of the medical establishment, and so there's those kind of cultural factors that we have to figure out how to overcome. And the main way we've thought about that is that we need therapists of color to make patients of color feel more comfortable to volunteer for research. So we have a whole program, a health equity program, where we're trying to train especially therapists of color, Native American therapists, Hispanic therapists, so that people will have therapists that look like them. Not that that's the only way you can get help, but we're trying to really overcome those resistance. And I think the resistance inside the VA, David Shulkin was the head of the VA for a couple of years, and I spoke with him about 6 months ago, and he was telling me that that I was really naive, that this idea that we could ever introduce psychedelics into the VA, he was just like, you should give it up. It's naive, it's stupid. He said, it'll never happen. And then he said, the VA is designed to squash innovation. Now, this was the secretary of the VA. This is what he's saying is the VA is designed to squash innovation. And my only response was, it'll be all the more pleasurable for me to speak to you once we've started research in the VA, because I think we are going to succeed. I think they are opening up. They have resisted for a very long time. It's been since 1990 that we first started to offer funds actually to the VA to study MDMA, back when it was just Vietnam vets. And it's only now we're just about a month and a half away from treating the first person inside the VA with MDMA. So I think change is happening inside the VA at a rapid state, and I also think hopefully in the military, that view that you shouldn't acknowledge emotional consequences of things. But the thing that we have not yet broken is that we have had about 40 vets in our studies, but we haven't had a single active duty soldier. And so that's the direction that we're hoping to move in also.
Well, I think I have a lot of questions, so I could go on for hours on this. So maybe I should just bite my tongue.
Oh, no, go ahead. I'd be curious.
Well, I'm curious about the striking the right balance. So, I think that I talk to a lot of active duty service members who I think are really at the most significant risk, because they are disincentivized from seeking help because it can affect their operational status, for instance. But they're also under the constant pressures of deployments. And so I've had service members tell me that they, contemplated suicide while on deployment, and that they would really stand to benefit the most from psychedelics. However, you also have to worry about, maybe it's just perception, but the idea that psychedelics just become a tool to create super soldiers, or, we become kind of a repair shop for soldiers before sending them back out into combat again. And I'm just kind of curious. I'm sure you've had to navigate this issue before, but I'm really curious about MAPS' approach.
Yeah. Well, to the extreme, a friend of mine, Torsten Passy, who Matt knows, a German psychiatrist, he said, and the perception of the U.S. military is different outside of the United States than it is inside the United States. So he was like, well, are you doing this, creating these, not just so much super soldiers, but they do things that maybe they have ethical questions about, and you give them an MDMA session, now they feel okay about it, and then they go back and do more stuff. And he said, would you give MDMA therapy to a Nazi concentration camp guard? What if they get stressed from all of that? Would you give them MDMA therapy? My answer to that was, yes, I would. And also, I think that when you can help soldiers who are active duty to process their emotions, I think they'd be better soldiers. Better meaning that they won't be overreacting to certain things that they need to, and they'll be more in tune with what's actually happening rather than this whole filter of, everybody's out to kill me, which is often the case. But I think that if you're attuned to the emotional consequences of what you do, both on yourself and others, I think you may be less willing to engage in violence unless it's necessary. Or, and these are hard distinctions, but if we were to treat a Nazi concentration camp guard with MDMA therapy, the hope is that they would start questioning, why are they doing that? I'll just go back further to say that when I was 18, that was the last year of the lottery, I was a draft resistor, but I was not a conscientious objector, because to be a conscientious objector, you have to be against all wars. You have to be a pacifist. And I'm not that. I think that there are sometimes you really need to defend yourself. So I think we really need a military, and we need the military to, and the military is actually under civilian guidance. So a lot of times I'm saying, the concerns that we have about the missions that they go on, we should direct them against the politicians. They're the ones, and that there's something honorable about being willing to sacrifice your life for the community and to volunteer for the military. So I think this idea of other kinds of healthcare, when you've got new ways to repair people who otherwise would have died in past wars, is that creating super soldiers? Now, a lot of those people, are so disabled they can't go back, but we have all sorts of ways of medical advances, and we don't say don't give those to soldiers because somehow or other you're making it easier to fight wars because you're reducing, the health consequences, because you're patching people up more effectively, and some of them can even go back to active duty service. I think we owe a duty of care to the people in the military, and I think the idea that they will become insensitive and heartless super soldiers, I think it's likely to be the opposite. Matt, do you have thought about that?
Oh, I've definitely thought about it, and I couldn't put it any better than you. We're in complete agreement. I just think I think it's sort of akin, like if this person was like dying on an operating or an emergency situation, you're going to let them die. It's the exact same thing. Like, you're not going to help this person. Would the folks posing this argument, would they not want a soldier, treated for a fatal injury? Of course you would hope they would, for, potentially fatal injury, or, if someone happened. And the same case has been made against, police. And it's like, wow, really? If you had a police officer who had a gunshot wound and they're in the emergency department, you think, really, is it that bad that you want this human being to die? Or that someone who's suffering, and the levels of, I'm sure the levels of trauma are very high, and part of is what's in the police and obviously the military, but it's what fuels many of the problems that we're dealing with as a society. And if you go to this eye for an eye, and really, if you go to the dark side, if you just go to hatred and just you see those people as fundamentally evil and beyond any human redemption, you've sort of lost. It's like that's the only hope. We're all that person. Like, we are all suffering. We're all dealing with our demons of one type or another, and like, you can't give up on that there's, you can't give up on humanity. You can't give up on, regardless of your political opinions and what your thoughts on this particular war or war in general, or the way police departments are run, or their behavior and systemic problem. Like, to me, it just comes down to just like, it's like your fundamental views on humanity. Like, are you really gonna, because ultimately we are that, at one time in our lives, we're going to be that person. We're going to be the wretched person that is beyond redemption. And that if it really was just about fairness, we deserve the worst that's coming to us. And it's like, there's the possibility for transcendence for everybody, and to recognize the humanity in everybody. And that's kind of what to me, that's what underlies this whole thing, helping people with psychedelics. Like, you've got to kind of have that faith.
Yeah. One of the things that I'm most proud of is that we have a full-time police officer, who's also a psychotherapist, who's going through our training program to learn how to give MDMA-assisted therapy to police officers with trauma. And it's even, what I didn't know really is that if you're a veteran, you have preferential hiring in police departments. And so you get people sometimes who are traumatized before they go in the military, traumatized in the military, then they get a job that's highly traumatizing as well. You see the worst of humanity. And we should really be helping those people, even prison guards, even, let's go to that. You know, we should be doing work like this in prison with prisoners, of course, but also with prison guards. And I think that my vision, you may find this amusing, but you know, I know that you have basic training to get into the military. I would think that in the future, ideally, everybody, when they leave the military, will get like an MDMA session, you know, or potentially psilocybin, or both, you know, just to ease that transition out, and to deal with all the challenges and emotional struggles that have built up while they were in the military. So that there's so much focus on training people for the military, but there's not as much on training them to leave the military and reintegrate with civilian society.
I agree, and I think a lot of other service members agree 100% with that. And actually, we see field trips, you know, program base camp as a kind of reverse boot camp.
Great.
So, yeah, definitely on board with that idea.
I do want to add in a question because I know we only have you guys for a certain amount of time here. We talked about the psychological effects of psychedelics. So if we're looking at, you know, whole health, body, mind, spirit, I'm wondering if you have any comments to say on the physiological or spiritual effects of psychedelics.
Yeah, well, physiological, let me say that we have focused on, you know, PTSD or addiction, depression, anxiety, social anxiety, things like that. But the new frontier is going to be the mind-body connection. So we've got like fibromyalgia, irritable bowel syndrome, Crohn's disease, pain, as Matt was talking about, the psychological aspects of pain, that we just started with sort of more purely psychological things, but now we need to be moving more into psychosomatic, or just the mind-body connection. So I think that that's going to really develop a lot, because there is so much interaction between the mind and the body that we have not really paid attention to. You know, eventually, the way that psychedelics can also help people who are meditators to have this deep experience and with psychedelics, and then you can learn how to do that on your own, you know, without the drug. So psychedelics can facilitate training for meditation, but also we talk so much about the placebo effect and how, you know, if you think you're getting an active drug, sometimes you actually show physiological benefits, that you mobilize your own immune system because of your beliefs. But how can we do that voluntarily? I think psychedelics may one day really help us understand the placebo effect and how to catalyze that without the drug, but without the false belief, you could say, that you've been given something that's active. So I think that that's going to be one of the more exciting parts of this. And then just as long as this supervisionary, let me just say that I had this chance to listen to Buckminster Fuller give a talk shortly before he died. And, you know, we talk about the oneness and how we're all connected and everything. And what he said was astonishing to me. He talked about how technology was focused on miniaturization of things, you know, and we see that now with our phones. I mean, these used to be computers that would take up a whole room, right? So we're getting everything miniaturized, and we're able to talk like we are now on Zoom, miraculous stuff. But what he said was that he thought the end result of this miniaturization was, and the way that we can communicate through technology, was going to be telepathy. And I was like, wow, this is a scientist talking about telepathy. So I think that one day in the long run, maybe psychedelics are going to help us with ESP or accessing those parts of our brain that we don't normally how to do. But, you know, we have stories. I mean, you've probably heard these stories about mothers that know when their sons are being killed in the war. You have these kind of like this mother's child bond that, you know, that there's somehow, now maybe you could say it's chance or things like that, but maybe one day we'll learn about these kind of interconnections that we have that are not from our five senses, but that still are connected. And maybe the same way psychedelics bring things from the unconscious to the surface, maybe we'll be able to figure out telepathy and communication in other ways as well.
Well, if telepathy is the logical conclusion of smartphones, then my mind goes to group texts and how do I turn off those notifications. So I don't know if we really want to end up there.
Good point. Matt, do you think that was ridiculous what I was just saying, or what?
Who, me?
Yeah.
No, not at all. I think that's been oh gosh, we may have even talked about this years ago, like in the middle of the night. But yeah, I have a fascination with the research on these psi phenomena, and I know David Luke is interested in this connection. And historically, you know, sort of the psi researchers and the psychedelic researchers, there was a commonality, but they kind of split after the 60s through mutual self-preservation. It's like it's enough of a albatross around your neck to be associated with either one. So I agree with you. I mean, I'm an empiricist. If it can be tested, test it. And it's like if there's not a mechanistic explanation for it right now, well, guess what? Most of the history of science is filled with the discovery of phenomenon for which the mechanism underlying it has not been discovered. I mean, that is more of the rule rather than the exception. So, if these phenomena are real, then 100 years from now, 5,000 years from now, we may, what we might call supernatural now, might have a very firm naturalistic explanation, in the same way that almost anything we do nowadays would look like pure magic to folks several hundred years ago. So, we ultimately have to be guided by empiricism. And, I think if there's something there, there's just like these anecdotes about the connections between psychedelics and these experiences are quite compelling. So, I mean, they're at least fun, make you go, and as a scientist, you just want to say, hey, what's the worst that can happen in an experiment is it doesn't work, you're going to get an answer of one type or another. So like we should do that type of research. So I agree. That's a really interesting frontier.
Yeah, the most psychic experience of my life was under the influence of MDMA.
Wow.
And I was under the influence of MDMA, but this other person was in a dream state. And kind of had this, and it's a longer story, but it's just to say that, the best evidence of my entire life on ESP came when I was in an MDMA state and this woman was in a dream state.
Fascinating.
Wonderful. Well, if no one has anything else to add to that, I think that's an amazing conversation and that should definitely be continued. I'm wondering, did you guys ever think that you would get into psychedelic therapy? Did you, when did you know, and what was life like before?
Well, I knew when I was 18, in 1972, that I would do this for my life. Before that, I was just very, you could say, very cognitive, not disconnected from my emotions, very politically oriented, and just in despair at the world, at the Holocaust, at the Cuban Missile Crisis, at the Vietnam War, just like, what is going on here? And also, my bar mitzvah failed to turn me into a man. And so the traditional rituals weren't working. And when I first took LSD, I was like, wow, this is what my bar mitzvah should have been. These kind of energies of who am I? Where do I fit in? As your ego is dissolving, these things. So I'd say beforehand, before LSD, I was in a terrific way thinking about what to do about how I could contribute to untangling the tangles of the world, and how I could also stay alive. Now my own government was wanting to send me to war to, potentially die, to kill other people. And with psychedelics, the first time I did it, and then luckily I also did lots of mescaline at the same time. I mean, not the same moment, but a lot of LSD, a lot of mescaline. It gave me hope. So I would say this is the contribution, the sense of connection, the sense of how we're all woven into this. And I would say that this came to me um, around the same time, a little bit after, we've had the first human on the moon, looking back. And so we had this overview effect that everybody was aware that, the Earth is one planet, that you can't see the borders of the countries from the space, that you can't see religions, we're all one ecosystem. And I felt like, wow, LSD is a way to help people internalize this, and then hopefully that will lead to more peace and understanding. So the first psychedelic experiences gave me hope, but at the same time, I wasn't mature enough to really handle them. So I had loads and loads of difficult psychedelic experiences, and that led me down the road into thinking about therapy as well.
Thank you, Rick. Adam.
No, I mean, if you'd asked me a number of years ago if I thought I would end up in the space, definitely not. I came into this with a very specific mandate, to help people from my specific community of combat veterans, because I'd seen it working for guys who were struggling. But I'm glad I'm here, and I'm just a little puppy dog in this space, especially compared to these guys. But I'm glad I'm here, and I hope I learn a lot more in the coming years.
Thank you, Matt.
Yeah, when I was in my very early 20s, I knew that I wanted to do science with psychedelics. I don't think the therapeutic aspect really captured me at that point, but I knew I was fascinated by their effects on the brain, and I was starting to become familiar with that earlier research and the whole history that we had, and this would have been in the mid to late 90s, and so I became familiar with that history from decades ago, and that had all the research had stopped. And so thankfully I was able to I had envisioned at that point that I would be doing research with psychedelics like 30 years later, once I had established myself and I was just as credible could be. But then I showed up at Hopkins when the first for a postdoc once I got my PhD, and learned actually in the interview for that position that there was this super secret at the time. I had to swear my firstborn that like you won't tell anyone about this if you, in a high dose psilocybin study. Like, okay, all right, I made I'm coming here to do my postdoc, not anywhere else. So I was able to jumpstart that process. And it was then after just not too long at all, especially with getting it actually guiding sessions, then I really, in terms of the therapeutic potential, that's where it really hit home for me, just so strongly. Seeing other people being affected by it. So not just sort of moving from this profound fascination of how it could affect the mind in this way to more specifically how it could really heal people.
Thank you so much. And I love all of the questions that you guys have asked today. That's definitely being an amazing dynamic to add to this. I'm just wondering if you have any final words that you'd like to leave with people here today.
Well, my final word is we'd like to go the whole way to sustainability through philanthropy rather than investors or loans. So I would encourage people to think, if they have been inspired by this conversation, to consider donating to research. I think one of the advantages of field trip and just for-profits is access to capital. And that capital can be deployed in really good ways. And one of the challenges of nonprofit drug development is access to capital. So we're trying to build our monthly donors and our base. And so I would also like to help people realize that even though we've been talking about all these big numbers, that anything that people want to donate makes a difference. And also that what we need is, if we look at other social change movements that have succeeded more recently, which has one of the best examples being gay rights, gay marriage, it was because people came out of the closet, and sort of now we know that instead of all these people that are being hiding themselves or hiding that part of themselves, that there's all sorts of people who've made incredible, great contributions who happen to be gay. And so I think we need a similar coming out in the psychedelic community. So I'd encourage people on World Psychedelic Day to, if they've had experiences with psychedelics, to share them with people, and not the normal suspects, but those people like maybe your parents or your relatives that you think might not be so sympathetic, to come out of the closet and share the stories, because that's what people really respond to, is stories from other people that they know and care for.
Adam, any final words you want to add?
Well, Rick touched on it a little bit already, but I would just say, I'm talking about vets this whole time, and I've kind of steered the conversation that way. But there's a lot of marginalized communities that don't get that same level of attention, and they need access as well. And so I think it's just important to point that out and keep it in mind.
Matthew?
Yeah, so I'll say lots of things I could say, but one is a lot of times folks reach out, about our studies, and so if anyone is interested in one of the studies, one of the many studies now we're conducting at Hopkins, to get on our website, www.hopkinspsychedelic.org. If we have a study, it's up on there, running right now. It's up there, and there's a way to start the screening for the particular studies. Some of them you have to live in the Baltimore area, some of them not necessarily. So if someone's looking to do a postdoc, I happen to be in the market. If you're aspiring to be a psychedelic scientist and you've gotten your PhD or your MD, and you're interested in this stuff, you can reach out, and again, you can find me through that same website. But,
yeah, Shannon, if I could just add one more point, Matt just reminded me. We are looking for people to volunteer for our phase 3 study. And so if you go to clinicaltrials.gov, which is a website where you have to post your clinical trials, and you put in PTSD, you put in MDMA, number 18, there's a lot of them are over and complete and stuff, but number 18 is our second phase 3 study, and it lists all the cities where we have studies, sites, who to contact, study coordinators. And so we'd really encourage it. And since this is World Psychedelic Day, we are starting to enroll people in Europe as well. So we have sites in the Netherlands, Germany, Norway, Portugal, the Czech Republic, and England. So we're people that have PTSD. If you're interested in volunteering for the studies, we'd encourage you to think about that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Well, it has been a pleasure having the three of you here today. And thank you so much for not only being here with us on World Psychedelics Day, but also sharing the important information that you have shared, and also doing the work that you're doing in the field. As we know, we're in a time where we need this more than ever. So, thank you so much for all of the work that you're doing. And it's been a pleasure having you here with us.
It's been a pleasure to be here with you all.
Pleasure. Take care, all.
Thank you to all of the people working behind the scenes to make this event a success. And thank you to all of our partners and sponsors that have helped in various ways. Thank you to all of you for being here to support this event, these speakers, and this movement. Also, all of these episodes will be recorded, and if you've grabbed the All Access Pass, you can watch the replays at your leisure. We thank you for your support and donations, and we'll see you in the next panel.
Welcome to World Psychedelic Day. It's the first annual World Psychedelics Day, and eventually we hope that the whole world will be psychedelicized.
Welcome to World Psychedelics Day.
Welcome to World Psychedelic Day.